Hello, my name is Katya Haskins. I'm a professor of communication arts and sciences at Pennsylvania State University. In my research, I investigate how various sites and rituals of memory, from museums and monuments to films and parades and social media sites, construct public memory. My topic today is museums as agents of national memory. In the course of my talk, I will introduce the notion of museum rhetoric and then present my case study, a special exhibit at the Museum of Moscow called The City of Victors. It was dedicated to the 70th anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. I chose this subject in part because this year marks the 80th anniversary of the beginning of World War II. In Russia, however, this anniversary is scarcely acknowledged. The majority of Russians today have learned to remember the Great Patriotic War, which began not on September 1st, 1939, but on June 22nd, 1941, when Hitler violated the Ribbentrop-Molotov non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union. The exhibit in question participates in the revival of the cult of the Great Patriotic War after its decline in the first post-Soviet decade. It draws on personal narratives of ordinary Muscovites to tell the story of patriotism and perseverance in wartime Moscow. However, as I will argue, its selection of objects and narratives, as well as its display strategy, in other words, its rhetoric, also contribute to the recovery of Joseph Stalin as a model national leader. So how do museums perform the work of national remembrance? It's safe to say that museums occupy a privileged place in contemporary memory culture. As the primary archival institutions of modernity, they have acquired the status of custodians of national histories. According to a recent study of European museum goers, people expect museums to accurately portray national pasts, and the mainstream view still holds that museums are among the most trustworthy carriers of explanations of our world. Yet in the last few decades, scholars across disciplines have questioned the museum status as a politically neutral repository of archival traces. They argue that objects on display in any museum constitute strategic choices made primarily by the museum's curatorial staff. Which stories and experiences are represented through the selection of objects is an index of the museum's participation in the larger public conversation about the past. As curator Bruce Ferguson argues, the voices heard within exhibitions constitute a highly observable politics. A rhetoric scholar, Elizabeth Weiser, considers the work of museums as a form of epideictic or display rhetoric. Museum rhetoric is clearly epideictic, using past events to evoke a consensus around present-day values and identities. When history museums present a narrative of past deeds, they're using their assembled artifacts to persuade visitors to embrace values that the nation collectively considers ideal. So history museums are trusted agents of national remembering, and especially if they're dependent on state sponsorship, they're often expected to tell the uplifting story of the nation. The issue then is not whether museums can be above politics, but rather what voices they recruit to tell narratives of national pasts and how they convince audiences to embrace the stories museum objects tell. To understand how history museums work as agents of memory, I argue we need to consider them both on macro and micro levels. The macro level refers to the larger cultural conversation about the past. History museums and exhibits do not exist in a vacuum, and their curators' choices both reflect and shape larger cultural and socio-political trends. The micro level includes specific curatorial and exhibition strategies museums employ to tell their stories and engage visitors. So before I turn to the micro level of the exhibit itself, I'd like to address the broader historical cultural context of the City of Victors. First of all, we have to look at the revival of the Soviet myth of the Great Patriotic War. On May 9, 1945, Nazi Germany officially surrendered to the Soviet Army and its allies, ending the bloodiest war of the 20th century. The Soviet Union paid a steep price for this victory. Over 20 million of its citizens lost their lives. Yet until 1960s, however, Victory Day was not treated as a national holiday. It was an occasion for private grief and local remembrance. Families would mourn the loss of loved ones at home, and veterans would don their medals and gather in parks and squares to celebrate their wartime camaraderie. Stalin's death in 1953 and Nikita Khrushchev's condemnation of Stalin's personality cult in 1956 led the way for the relative openness of public culture that lasted about a decade. Known as the Thaw, this period gave rise to a number of artistic explorations of the war experience, particularly in songs and films. But when Leonid Brezhnev ascended to power in 1964, he ended the thaw and ushered in a conservative cultural agenda focused on solidifying loyalty to the communist regime, whose legitimacy was beginning to fray in the wake of de-Stalinization. The Great Patriotic War was perfect material for a unifying myth. As historian Nina Tumarkin observed, in its idealized form, the war had everything: violence, drama, martyrdom, success, and a chic global status. Under Brezhnev, V-Day became a cornerstone of the Soviet identity. For 2 decades, the heroic myth of the war was promulgated through built environment, museums, films, songs, literature, and secondary school curricula. Giant memory parks, eternal flames, and other shrines to the war cult became fixtures of urban landscapes. The entire generation, my generation, grew up participating in official commemorative ceremonies such as proclaiming our allegiance to the Communist Party at the Eternal Flame or playing war games in summer camps. Soviet citizens internalized this commemorative repertoire as a kind of collective habit memory. These forms of war remembrance helped to entrench several beliefs about the war. First, that the war was righteous. In the Soviet Union, the war was referred to as the Great Patriotic War. The word choice obscures Stalin's crucial role in allowing Hitler to take over a large part of Europe prior to June 1941. In the myth, however, the blame for the war unequivocally rests on the Nazis, and the beginning of the war is June 22, 1941, the day when Nazi Germany unleashed its Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Second, that the Soviet people rose as one to defend the motherland at any cost. Third, that the Soviet army liberated Europe. Once it drove the Germans out of the Soviet Union, it went on to free the rest of occupied Europe from Nazism. And finally, whatever one thinks of Stalin, he was the architect of the Soviet victory in the war and therefore cannot be denounced as a bad leader. In the second half of the 1980s, during Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika, the main strands of the myth came under officially sanctioned scrutiny and criticism. Newly opened archives revealed that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and its secret protocols provided for a German-Soviet partition of Poland and the Soviet domination of Bessarabia and the Baltics. The extent of Stalin's repressions before and during the war was widely publicized in the mainstream press, and Stalin, as the commander-in-chief, was shown to be not quite as wise and strategic as he had been portrayed previously. It became evident that the Soviet army was poorly prepared to repel the German invasion despite repeated intelligence reports prior to the invasion. Stalin had purged many of the talented young generals just before the war for political reasons, and the lack of capable military leadership, coupled with the lack of basic equipment, turned millions into tank fodder. By the time I finished high school and was preparing for my university entrance exams, much had changed under Gorbachev. So much of the previously hidden information concerning the dark spots of the Soviet past was brought to light that history books were declared inadequate and history was eliminated from the roster of entrance exam subjects. When I graduated from Moscow State University in 1991, officially sanctioned revelations of Stalin's repressions and of the war as a tragic and messy, rather than heroic event, dominated public culture. By the mid-1990s, the war cult seemed to have waned. Now, if I had fallen asleep in 1991 and like some Russian Rippenwinkel awoke in the early 2000s, I would have been shocked by the extent of the revival of the war cult under President Vladimir Putin. In today's Russia, the Great Patriotic War, and it is emphatically the Great Patriotic War, not World War II, again acquired the status of the sacred event of the past. For Putin, the memory of the war has been an instrument of national unity, especially since the beginning of his third term as president, after massive public demonstrations against the rigged presidential election of 2012, Putin has drawn increasingly on the memory of the war to shore up his presidency. The revival of the cult of the Great Patriotic War has taken many forms, both official and grassroots. Indeed, officially sponsored historical institutions have begun to leverage the people's memory to legitimize a preferred version of history of the war. As Russian historian Nikolai Kaposov has observed, the likening of the country's history to family memory has been key to the official rhetoric of the Kremlin and the Ministry of Education. The arguments, Kaposov explains, can be boiled down to this, that pluralism is good, but you cannot bring up children on a negative image of their country. After all, the reason no one would educate them using a negative image of their family. Recent history textbooks that replaced the revisionist ones from the 90s often appeal to family memory. Many contain homework assignments asking students to interview their grandparents about what they're proud of in their past. In this way, family memory is presented in these new textbooks as a legitimate alternative to professional evaluations of history. The mobilization of memory allows to overcome and marginalize the academic mainstream linked to the 90s criticism of the country's totalitarian past and the defense of democratic ideals. Appeals to family memory work to naturalize the revival of the uncritical celebration of the good war. In conjunction with family memory as a criterion of historical relevance and significance, we can also observe another trend. I call it ambient Stalinism, or diffusion of positive representations of Stalin in the public sphere. Good memories of the Stalin era are indivisible from the proud remembrance of the war, since it is rooted in Stalin's conception of the war as the holy war in defense of the motherland. It has become acceptable to express admiration for Stalin as a strong leader who brought the people together and not only triumphed over Germany, but also expanded the Soviet sphere of influence in Europe. Fond memories of Stalinism go hand in hand with a nostalgia for the old world order in which the Soviet Union was a major player in the international arena. Anniversaries of the victory in the Great Patriotic War often serve as a pretext for bringing Stalin's image out of museum archives and for erecting new monuments to him. Flags featuring Stalin and the slogan, "Thanks to Grandfather for the victory," have been spotted for several years during V-Day marches of the Immortal Regiment, a multi-city parade of civilians honoring their relatives who took part in the war. Likenesses of Stalin, including costumed impersonators of Generalissimo, often appear in heavily trafficked urban spaces without any official prohibition, which contributes to the ambience of Stalinist revival. This allows the state to reposition Stalin as the locus of the popular rather than official, and thereby to bolster Putin's status as a leader whose own charismatic popularity is based on his willingness to accommodate the desires of those nostalgic for Stalin's authority. So the diffusion of Stalin's images throughout public spaces works to normalize the positive legacy of Stalinism. My case study, the V-Day anniversary exhibit, City of Victors, showcases how appeals to honor ancestral memory are constructed by museum exhibits dedicated to the Great Patriotic War. Here I turn to a micro-level analysis of museums as persuasive spaces. As such, persuasive spaces, they combine visual, spatial, oral, and discursive display strategies to situate spectators as co-creators of historical narratives. How do museums construct and tell their stories and engage visitors? Museums' rhetoric involves the selection and arrangement of objects and texts. The selection is often guided by what story the objects on display can tell. Museums form narratives through chronological and causal arrangements of objects, but the chronology and causality can be signaled more or less explicitly. A more explicit chronology is evident when objects are presented in context. Objects are set in context by means of long labels, charts, diagrams, or commentary delivered by earphones. Objects are often set in context by means of other objects, often in relation to a classification or schematic arrangement of some kind. By contrast, in situ installations fashion an environment in which the relationship among exhibited objects is less explicit. Such installations privilege experience and tend to thematize rather than set their subject forth. As distinct from a more cerebral appeal of in-context displays, in situ arrangements involve visitors' senses, emotions, and imagination. Museums thus construct three-dimensional narratives that ask the visitor to move not only through time, the chronology of the exhibit, but also through space, the architecture and arrangement of a display, in a way lacking in books, films, or any other form of narrative. The City of Victors exhibit advances a triumphalist narrative of the war by deploying a selection of artifacts and narrative accounts contributed by regular Muscovites. This narrative is shaped not through dogmatic statements, but through subtle arrangement of archival objects and testimonials. Together, letters, diaries, posters, and domestic objects tell the story of wartime sacrifices, perseverance, and camaraderie. But they also support a portrayal of Stalin as the inspiration behind the people's war effort. The exhibit thus invites visitors to align their understanding of Russia's past with the supposedly pious attitude of previous generations. The will to influence is at the core of any exhibition, contends Bruce Ferguson. The Museum of Moscow, however, downplays its decisive role in shaping the narrative. Instead, contributors, ordinary Muscovites of the war generation and their descendants, are presented as the source of historical authenticity and emotional appeal to visitors. Consider the framing of the museum's mission statement. Upon entering the exhibit, the visitor encounters an invitation printed in black letters on a red background. It says, "We have never stopped and will never stop collecting materials related to the Great Patriotic War and its participants. Please bring and pass on these materials for safekeeping and perpetuity. Let's write the history of our country together." Visually, this statement evokes the look of wartime posters. Not incidentally, to the right of the statement is a framed poster exhorting the viewer to join the ranks of the people's resistance and picturing men in uniforms clutching rifle bayonets. The poster overlaps an enlarged photograph that presumably depicts this volunteer army. Finally, a handwritten note penned by a volunteer and who identifies himself as a communist and a librarian at the Lenin State Library in Moscow gives voice to the spirit of self-sacrifice implied by the poster. Answering the call of the people's leader, Comrade Stalin, I wish to join the ranks of people's resistance and give all my energy to the cause of defeating the fascist barbarians who treacherously invaded our country. The handwritten application is an example of an archival document entrusted to the museum for safekeeping, but it fulfills other functions as well. It appears to answer the call of the poster and in its earnest, if formulaic way, confirms the spirit of dedication to the collective cause and Comrade Stalin. This textual visual collage establishes the museum's role as a depository of people's contributions, asserts the desirability and authenticity of collective history writing, and positions the spectator as a grateful successor of the wartime generation. To increase the viewer's identification with the selected voices of ordinary people, several display strategies convey what it felt like to live in the city between June 1941 and May 1945. The exhibit uses both in situ and in context approaches. In situ displays of streetscapes and domestic interiors are juxtaposed with personal narratives inscribed on poster-sized panels and glass cases. The life-size anti-tank fortifications set against the backdrop of a photograph of Moscow's barricaded streets in the fall of 1941 evoke the atmosphere of the days when the German tanks rolled dangerously close to the city. Nearby, the archival video footage of wartime Moscow is framed by a wall of stacked sandbags, so as the visitor is peeking through the opening at the footage, her senses of smell and touch add to the feeling of immersion. Another in situ display featuring a wartime Moscow apartment is complete with a small wood-burning stove and a radio. We are invited to imagine families, women, children, and grandparents gathered in the space listening to a radio dispatch from the front. To assist the visitor's imagination, multiple text panels feature recollections of Muscovites who endured through the hardships. A member of the Moscow Anti-Air Defense Unit recalls, "Gradually we got used to the war routine and even found it somewhat romantic. One has to live somehow. After the chaos of air raids, you would come back to the room, light up the stove, and stare at the fire. And then you remember the days at the Young Pioneer Camp and the bonfires. Too bad that it's hard to procure firewood. We had to burn part of the furniture and dismantle the fence outside. After the war, there will be no more fences." Even ballerinas joined the battle at the home front. An excerpt from a diary of the Bolshoi Theater ballerina describes how she and her colleagues volunteered to dig trenches to prepare for the defense of Moscow. "We returned in the early morning, could not even take off the clothes. Moscow soil is so heavy. I had never thought that I would be shoveling dirt and that I could survive. But I have 8 years of standing at the bar. Beside me, all the girls, skinny, beautiful, are digging trenches through the night. Our little soldiers would know how to persevere." Moscow residents adapted to regular air raids and scarce food rations. The text printed on a glass case surrounding the living room display details wartime realities. First, everyone had to have a roll of black paper to cover the windows during air raids. Second, it was important to keep one's keys in a certain place in order to quickly run to the bomb shelter at any moment. And three, the clock had to be easily visible because the raids were carried out punctually. Children, too, responded to wartime privation with equanimity, as another testimony tells us. Habitually hungry kids sometimes talked among themselves about tasty pre-war food, remembering festive dinner parties at home, but they calmly accepted their hungry existence. These small-scale, intimate details of the residents' day-to-day lives prompt the visitor to imagine living in cold apartments, subsisting on meager rations of black bread, and anticipating the next air raid. At the same time, they testified to the spirit of collective resilience, echoing the theme of self-sacrifice expressed by posters and letters of volunteers. The narrative is shaped through a kind of multimodal polyphony. Texts, images, and objects work together to conjure the feeling of the period rather than walk the audience through the cut-and-dry chronology of the war. The exhibit is elliptical in its presentation of events stretching between June 22, 1941 and May 9, 1945, and spotlights only what Moscow residents apparently remember most. A photograph of the military parade on November 7, 1941, the parade whose participants marched straight to the front, represents the critical moment at the beginning of the war when the civilian population was mobilized to the defense of Moscow. The selection of this event is also noteworthy as a reflection of Russia's present-day commemorative politics. Under Putin, the reenactment of this parade, which itself was a celebration of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, has become an iconic ritual in the resurgent cult of the Great Patriotic War. The V-Day, May 9, 1945, represents the culmination of the war for most visitors, even though the Soviet Union, bound by its obligation to the Allies, officially continued to participate in hostilities against Japan. Posters and large photographs and testimonies recall the collective jubilation that consumed the city in the days following Germany's capitulation to the Allies. As one of featured recollections put it, that night and the whole day following, our entire large Moscow, like a communal apartment, sang, danced, and cried. How terrible that not all have survived. Like the chronology of war events, the terrible price of victory is left unspecified. The exhibit represents the collective loss through another in situ installation, a minimalist table set for a wake. On the table, simple glasses, each supposedly filled with the traditional vodka and covered with a slice of black bread, stand in for those who will never return home. The wake table is a peculiar island in the overall spatial narrative of the exhibit. Its abstract character, a simple wooden table and benches devoid of any historical specificity of style, suggests that the grief for wartime losses transcends time, that it somehow continues to haunt the present. However, the table is positioned in the center of the hall, whose wall space is covered with victory posters and enlarged photographs of festive crowds. The laconic representation of loss and mourning is literally encircled by images of triumph. In addition to its immersive portrayal of the ordinary heroism of Moscow residents, the exhibit extols the righteous cause behind the heroism by appealing to the audience's emotions. In line with the Soviet-era myth of the war, the Soviet army is depicted as a liberator of the entire Europe. The audience is presumed to agree with the strand of the war myth, as the only mnemonic prompt on display is an excerpt from a patriotic lyric by Yevgeny Vinokurov, Muscovites. The poem commemorates two young men who died in battle far away from home. In the fields beyond the sleepy Vistula, in the moist earth are lying Seroshka from Malaya Bronne and Vitka from Mokhovaya. Known only by their first names and street addresses, these soldiers personified the Soviet army's sacrifice. Their girlfriends stopped waiting for them and married other men, the poem tells us, but these ordinary Muscovites are remembered by the saved world. Not incidentally, in May 2015, the Saved World Remembers was used as a slogan throughout public spaces in central Moscow and other Russian cities to urge the recognition of the international debt of gratitude for the Soviet Union's role in World War II. Along with celebrating ordinary heroes, the exhibit resurrects the memory of Stalin as the architect of Soviet victory in World War II. It does so indirectly. It avoids overt commentary in the form of textual labels and instead allows archival documents to paint him as the ultimate inspiration behind the people's war effort. A number of posters throughout the exhibit epitomize the worshipful attitude toward the people's leader. One poster salutes the defenders of Moscow, the people and the army, who saved the capital supposedly under Stalin's leadership. Another poster features the Generalissimo's image on a victory medal, which also bears the leader's winged phrase, "Our mission is righteous, we have won." The poster's imagery is quasi-religious. The medal bearing Stalin's profile is sun-like, and its rays illuminate the figure of a soldier surrounded by cheering crowds. Lest we suspect the Museum of Propaganda in favor of Stalin, The curators marshaled documents composed by ordinary people to illustrate the widespread piety toward him. The case in point is the previously cited volunteers' application to join the ranks of the People's Resistance. Elsewhere in the exhibit is a school composition book open to an essay titled Stalin, the Great Military Leader. The essay's dutifully formulaic prose recounts the highlights of Stalin's military career, including his decisive leadership in the Battle of Moscow. The inclusion of Stalin imagery and references in both official and vernacular documents, and the avoidance of direct commentary by museum staff, suggests that the leader's aura infused the very air breathed by the wartime generation. The implicit argument is, whatever view of Stalin we may hold today, the war generation's values and deeds are inextricably linked to their faith in him. The exhibit thus discourages the viewer from judging their pieties and suggests that our memory of the war should be aligned with the perspective of our forefathers. Questioning the tenets of the war myth, therefore, would be tantamount to betraying their memory. Considering the exhibit in relation to ambient Stalinism outside the museum's walls, this seems to be the preferred interpretation. The museum promotes grateful identification with the forefathers as the preferred visitor stance by juxtaposing the dedication of ordinary soldiers and civilians of the 1940s with the attitudes of later generations. The curators, in fact, single out the late 1980s as the low point in the collective memory of the war. The evaluation of this period, however, is entrusted to an ordinary Muscovite, not a historian, whose recent recollection takes the visitor back to the heady days of glasnost and perestroika. In his testimony, this now middle-aged man remembers his conversation with his grandfather in 1989 at the height of Gorbachev's glasnost, which also happened to be a time of scarcity. A war veteran, his grandfather was entitled to monthly food rations. The author mentions that at the time, the Soviet Union was even receiving humanitarian aid from Germany, which was helpful as the stores were mostly empty. The grandfather would come home tired and grumpy, since it would take hours to stand in a queue for groceries. He would joke that it was easy at the front. The interaction between grandfather and grandson that follows highlights the young generation's cynicism. One time I asked him, "Grandpa, maybe the victory was all in vain. We would probably live like Europeans now, contentedly." In response to which he sighed and answered simply, "Then you wouldn't exist. So many years have passed, and he's long gone, but I'm still ashamed." This is a remarkable statement, especially in the way it evokes shame about the period in the country's history, the late 80s and 90s, when the state was opening its archives and the full extent of Stalin's crimes became exposed. The selection of this particular memory fragment as emblematic serves a didactic function. The testimony paints the post-war generation's disillusionment in the war as betrayal of the forefathers and, by extension, of the nation. From a perspective of the present, to question the cost and the point of sacrifices in the Great Patriotic War is the height of ingratitude. By prominently showing this contrite testimony, the exhibit urges its audience to disavow the late Soviet scrutiny of the war myth and thereby to dismiss any doubts about the righteous mission of which Comrade Stalin assured his people. The exhibit, City of Victors, claims to represent the voice of the people. Aside from the exhortation, "Let's write the history of our country together," the curator's speech is tacit and oblique. In the exhibit's spatial narrative, the museum goer encounters multiple voices presented through a variety of media. The rhetoric of the exhibit is thus multimodal and polyvocal, but this does not mean that there isn't a preferred deep narrative that the visitor is invited to construct through the experience. Deep narrative, explains Weiser, operates both below and above the surface of an exhibit. Such a narrative might be seen in what is emphasized or de-emphasized in the displays, what follows what in the galleries, and even what is or not offered for sale in the gift shop or repeated in the marketing materials. In situ installations, photographs, posters, and narrative recollections add up to a unified account that reaffirms the Soviet-era war myth about the courageous and unified people that under the wise leadership of Stalin rose as one to repel the German aggressor and liberated Europe from fascism. The apparent polyphony yields an uplifting account of the collective trauma of the war. Moreover, through its selection of voices, the exhibit comments on public memory of the war and implicitly advocates for an emotional identification rather than critical detachment as the preferred attitude to the collective past. Objects on display give the visitor intimate access to the thoughts, feelings, and routines of representatives of the war generation and their descendants. It is difficult to doubt the sincerity of their beliefs and values, or to argue with the existential truth of their accounts. The exhibit positions the visitor as a member of this family-like community of feeling. The rhetoric of the exhibit thus participates in the state's cultural program of revising the nation's history and using the gratitude to our ancestors as an excuse to resurrect Stalin as a model national leader. So what lessons about museums and exhibitions as agents of national remembrance can we learn from this? Museums are not above politics. Their approach is shaped by their participation in larger cultural conversations about the past. Stories museums tell, therefore, resonate with other cultural discourses outside museum walls. The museum's selection of artifacts and their display strategies are not simply informational. They're spaces of persuasion that appeal to their audience's senses and emotions. In so doing, they make audiences co-creators of national narratives as a way to give legitimacy to potentially problematic stories of national greatness. Thank you very much.